One of television's brightest brains, Simon Cowell lit up the stage for millions of unheard voices. He went from being a forgettable mailroom clerk to becoming the most influential person in the entertainment industry. He became known as the industry's golden eye because of his nearly magical talent spotting skills, which transformed ordinary people into legendary figures. He shaped the definition of true television power for more than 20 years, inspiring millions of musical aspirations and emerging as the quintessential representation of peak broadcasting and brutal standards. Simon Cowell, the creative force behind Got Talent, The X Factor, and American Idol, the programs that produced a whole generation of international celebrities. However, there is a tragic and unglamorous tale behind that heritage. A secret battleground of suffering, deteriorating health, unending loneliness, and misfortunes from which celebrity could never shield him. For years, the world has praised his might. However, few are ready to confront the unsettling reality he now bears, fighting with shadows so dense that not even his immense wealth can lift them. Before we start, please leave a like in honor of a man who lost his life to ignite others' aspirations if those shows ever inspired you to believe, cry, or laugh. Beneath the roar of international renown is a harsh reality. Instead of bright spotlights, Simon Cowell's first stage was filled with the icy, heartless quiet of a childhood devoid of love. He was born in Lambeth, London in 1959 and grew up in the sleepy town of Elstree, Hertfordshire, in a family that appeared glamorous on the surface but was actually shattered by invisible wounds. His mother, socialite and ballet dancer Julie Brett, appeared to move through life with grace but maintained her emotional distance. His father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell, was a music businessman and real estate tycoon who provided little affection but measured success in achievement and discipline. As minor as it may seem to others, that lack of praise became a lifelong scar, a shadow that followed him into every room, every stage, and every silent night. School provided no escape. Years later, Simon would painfully admit, "My father never said, 'I'm proud of you,' even when I needed it the most." Simon was forgotten, while his contemporaries were remembered at Radlett Preparatory School and later Dover College. He wasn't the standout student his parents may have hoped for, but rather the restless youngster who disobeyed rules, fought with authority, and bore the shame of not living up to expectations. In his family's world, excellence was currency, and Simon felt completely worthless. He was the boy on the periphery, present but invisible, restless but unheard, and he barely made it through with a GCE in English and sociology. Instead of feeling relieved, he left with the crushing weight of disappointment. He was at the bottom of an empire founded on popularity when his father, out of pity rather than pride, got him a job in the mailroom at EMI Music. By his late teens, rejection had become a familiar ghost, echoing the same sentence he had carried since childhood. "You are not enough." "I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight." Simon would later recall a confession that still stings with its raw ache. He left EMI once, too humiliated to stay, but the world outside offered nothing but more rejection. Simon carried coffee to producers who never knew his name every morning, sorted fan mail for artists whose songs filled arenas, and his own presence dissolved into invisibility. After work, Simon confessed, he would cry quietly in the bathroom, not only of failure, but also of the haunting fear that his life had already peaked before it had even begun. Doors slammed shut, confidence crumbled, and he crawled back to the mailroom he had once hated in despair. Despite this, a different fire started to smolder in the rubble of humiliation. His childhood was hardly a fairy tale, rather, it was hardening him. He learnt defiance from rejection, and he sculpted resolution from neglect. The youngster who had been denied love was gradually evolving into the man who would make the world take notice. The youngster who had sobbed in secret was about to enter a field as cruel as the childhood that had already left wounds on his spirit. It was a crucible, and every unspoken word of affection and every delayed embrace served as the fire that shaped his unrelenting, almost vicious ambition. Armed only with the scars of rejection and an unyielding will, Simon Cowell entered the music industry, determined that his name would no longer be associated with invisibility. Disgraced but unfazed, he went back to EMI's mail office, a place he had formerly hated, where every stack of albums and every unopened letter served as his silent school. It wasn't brilliance that opened my path, but raw grit, relentless persistence, and the refusal to let the verdict of not enough dictate the rest of my life. He studied not only music but power itself, how fame was packaged, how stars were created, and how dreams were sold. By the early 1980s, Simon dared to risk everything. He founded his own label, Fanfare Records, with E.A. and Burton. At first, the gamble appeared to be fortunate, with glittering pop songs like Sinata's So Macho making Simon, the once invisible boy, visible everywhere. He hosted parties, shook hands with people who had previously ignored him, and tasted the intoxicating sparkle of success for the first time. But champagne can turn sour in an instant. By the end of the decade, Fanfare was nothing more than a shell, its offices deserted, its contracts worthless, and Simon, barely in his 30s, left with nothing but debts and despair. Friends disappeared like smoke, doors slammed shut, and creditors circled like vultures as the market changed. Trends withered, and the empire he believed he was building fell apart with brutal speed. To the world, it was a failed business venture, but to Simon, it was a personal devastation. As if the little boy, deprived of love, had become a man devoid of dignity. The humiliation was so deep that he went back to his parents' house and retreated to the same bedroom from his childhood that had once echoed with loneliness. A room that now whispered failure. Time almost broke me, he would confess years later with eerie candor, remembering how he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. Invisible again. A harsh reminder that in the entertainment business, victory is brittle and cruelty is unavoidable. But something fierce rose from the ashes of that ruin. Simon Cowell was not destroyed by the collapse of Fanfare, rather, it strengthened him. He started researching not only music, but also the architecture of fame itself, asking himself what makes an audience go silent, how they cheer, and what makes them remember. Every humiliation, sleepless night, and bitter taste of failure served as the raw material for a man who would one day take control of television and change the rules of entertainment. As a symbol of power whose empire was born not of privilege but of pain, Simon Cowell's career did not start with glamour. Rather, it started with ashes. From those ashes, he started the ascent that would eventually make him both admired and despised. He stood at a ruthless crossroads that would either bury him in permanent obscurity or force him to claw his way back into an industry that had already eaten him up and spat him out. He didn't return to the music industry in the early 1990s as a rising star, rather. He arrived at BMG as a man with the stain of failure on his name, a man whose empire had fallen apart before it had even started. Every meeting was a reminder of his humiliation, and every handshake was tinged with the silent question, can this man really deliver? Simon had to fight for the merest scraps of opportunity rather than being praised as a visionary. He swallowed his pride and tore it up. The illusions of chasing timeless artists vanished, and he rebuilt his philosophy from the ground up, rethinking everything he believed he knew about music. He realized painfully clearly that ordinary people, not critics, were the ones who purchased records. And he would later admit, I learned the hard way. Get respect later, sell records first. It was not glamour but desperation that led him to sign acts that others scorned, such as boy bands like Westlife, pop groups like Five, and ballad duos like Robson and Jerome. Purists made fun of them, journalists laughed, but their records sold by the millions. And every success was bittersweet. Even when he outsold their so-called stars, the business scorned him as cheap, tainting his triumph. However, beneath those sneers, Simon was learning the most important lesson of his life: connection, not perfection, was what made fame. There were nights I lay awake convinced I would lose it all again, he later acknowledged. Nevertheless, the road was steep and lonely. For every hit there were endless nights of fear, and behind every chart success there was the dread that another collapse could strip it all away again. He turned rejection into a compass, following the heartbeat of the crowd rather than the approval of insiders. A revelation that revealed the frailty of even his triumphs. The year that changed everything, however, was 2001. With Pop Idol, Simon emerged from the gloom of boardrooms and onto the brilliant stage of television. Many thought he was too harsh, too icy, and too ruthless to appeal to the general population, making him unsuited for the screen. However, the crowd referred to what they called brutality as truth. Weary of polite lies, his incisive honesty, keen tongue, and reluctance to sugarcoat failure energized the audience. As Pop Idol gained popularity, Simon Cowell's face became as well known as the celebrities he evaluated. What started out as a last-ditch effort turned into a cultural revolution for the entertainment industry as a whole. Not just for him. Simon's journey was never a happy one, from the shame of returning to his parents' house to the limelight of primetime television. It was a battle won by having the courage to accept what others rejected, battled with scars, and persevered with determination. The road from the ashes of fanfare to the success of pop stars was not one of grandeur, but rather of rejection, sneers, and nights of hopelessness that compelled him to change who he was. And that reimagining became the unbreakable cornerstone of the empire he would eventually rule. Simon Cowell was no longer the unnoticed mailroom boy or the bankrupt businessman sifting through the ruins of bankruptcy by the early 2000s. He was now the face of a brand new entertainment period. He was a household name thanks to Pop Idol. And the change was finished when American Idol debuted in 2002. Millions of people watched week after week to hear Simon's decision, in addition to the aspiring performers. Like the performances themselves, his scathing comments, raised eyebrows, and stinging silences became iconic. Audiences welcomed his candor, which some perceived as brutality, and he quickly became the most talked about person on TV. By the middle of the decade, Simon Cowell was more than just a music entrepreneur, because to the UK's X Factor and the diffusion of talent around the world, he was the dream arbiter. A guy whose words have the power to instantly make or ruin lives. At his height, formats bearing his name were being watched by over 600 million people in 100 countries. According to the media, he was the most influential person on television. However, Simon found that power comes at a devastating cost. He was hated because of the same directness that made him renowned. Those who saw only the harshness and not the conviction portrayed him as a villain. And he was jeered in public and in tabloids. Years later he acknowledged, "I knew people hated me, but I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." His candor created an empire, but it also left him enmeshed in controversy, standing as a king on a throne that, ironically, seemed more like a jail. The timetable was brutal behind the cameras. He had to deal with never-ending auditions, live performances, international franchises, and the crushing weight of entire brands. Days turned into criticism, nights into strategy discussions. Too soft, too commercial, too harsh, and too predictable. He felt increasingly alone as he ascended. In his private life, stillness took the place of television viewers laughing. His sense of belonging had been sapped by success, which had stuffed his bank accounts. Romances ended, friends drifted away, and the youngster who had previously been deprived of love had now become a man who was deprived of tranquility. Even in the midst of filming, with all the lights and cheers, I frequently felt totally alone. He admitted candidly, "It was awful," that cruel irony. Frequently, the man who gave millions their moment of fame ended his own nights without anyone acknowledging him. Nevertheless, Simon's fame was cemented in this horrific crucible. In addition to changing television, he also changed how the public and celebrities interact. For the first time, viewers had the impression that they were sitting next to him, choosing who should and shouldn't be a celebrity. He became controversial because of the part, but it also made him memorable. Simon Cowell had accomplished the seemingly unachievable at the height of his dominance. His invisibility had vanished. The world was unable to turn away, but the splendor was accompanied with loneliness, tiredness, and the lingering worry of whether the empire he established had cost him the things he had most desired for all his life. The cameras caught Simon Cowell grinning when he first took his baby in his arms in February 2014. But they were unable to record the tempest that the young boy had calmed. Eric was more than just a baby. He was a man standing in the ruins of one of the most terrible periods of his life. A lifeline given to a frail miracle. When Simon learned that he was expecting a child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew, just a few months prior, in 2013 his meticulously planned world fell apart. It wasn't merely rumors. Every aspect of his reputation was charred by the raging firestorm. Betrayal screamed from the headlines. Every detail was examined by tabloids, and the man who had once shaped the story of innumerable careers was now caught in one from which he was unable to break free. He was suddenly positioned as the judged rather than the master judge of talent. The quiet departure of friends who turned their backs, the rumors that followed him into every room, and the heartbreaking conclusion that trust is rarely restored were the things that hurt the most about the betrayal, not the public's indignation. Andrew Silverman claimed adultery as the reason for his divorce. And Simon, who had once been a symbol of strength and assurance, yearned simply to be invisible. There were no justifications or spin, just a somber tone of regret when he later acknowledged, in one of his few moments of candor, "It was not something I'm proud of. It was the most helpless moment in the life of a man who had based his empire on dominance." However, an unanticipated rebirth emerged from that same disarray. The story changed from scandal to salvation with the birth of Eric. Simon's universe, which had previously been based on revenue and ratings, now centered on small hands and bedtime customs. In the calm of a nursery, the man who used to yell commands in boardrooms now learned to read children's books. He substituted the chilly glare of studio lights for the cozy glow of parenthood. Contracts for Lego towers, and criticism for lullabies. Later on, he admitted, "My priorities have entirely shifted." Suddenly, contracts and ratings didn't matter in my universe. It has to do with him. It was immediately apparent to those closest to him. The unrelenting business magnate who had formerly traveled across oceans for work now planned his days around bath time, story time, and the small miracle of seeing his son go to sleep. But redemption is never without scars. The scandal had left wounds that even fatherhood could not heal, the loss of friendships, the erosion of trust, and a guilt that hung like a shadow in the quiet between lullabies and laughter. One associate recalled, "Fatherhood saved him. He was on a dark path even before the scandal." Eric gave him a reason to stop, to heal, to begin again. Simon acknowledged that he had lost friends. "I became distrustful." The paradox was stark, a miracle wrapped in debate, a gift born from ashes. "But I gained something I never knew I needed." It was not a victorious escape from consequence, but a reckoning he would carry for the rest of his life. For the tabloids, it was a passing scandal, but for Simon, it was a scar that permanently changed him. What was compelling about his transformation was that it was real, not staged for the cameras or staged by publicists. It was evident in the softened edges of a man once defined by sharpness, in the patience that replaced harshness, in the humility that success had never taught him. Fatherhood did not erase the scandal, but it gave it purpose. Perhaps that is why this chapter is so memorable. It is not the story of a scandal, but rather of a man who was broken by his own decisions and found redemption in the most unexpected way, because the fire that almost destroyed him turned into the furnace in which a new Simon was forged, one who was less haughty, more vulnerable, and more human. The loss of his mother, Julie Brett, in 2015, just as Simon Cowell was learning to balance himself in the new role of fatherhood, dealt him a blow that no amount of fame or wealth could ease. It serves as a reminder that even the strongest are weak, that mistakes carry consequences, and that sometimes the light we need most does not arrive despite our failures, but because of them. The world might have seen it as a natural dying, the tranquil end of a long life. But to Simon it was destruction. She had lived to the amazing age of 89, a graceful former ballet dancer who carried herself with composure even as age slowed her steps. When Julie passed away in July of that year, Simon was in the middle of producing The X Factor. Cameras, deadlines, and contestants suddenly became irrelevant, and he stepped back, canceling commitments and retreating into grief that stripped him of the armor he had worn for decades. Julie had been the anchor in a stormy childhood, the silent witness to his rebellions, and the one person whose approval he always longed for, even when it was rarely spoken. But in 1999, long before he became famous worldwide, Simon had buried his father, Eric, a strict but guiding figure who never lived to see his son emerge from bankruptcy to become a household name. For years, Simon carried that regret in private, acknowledging that the one man whose approval he had sought the most never got to see the success that need for approval had created. This wound, however, made the pain of losing his mother even more acute. Now that his mother had also passed away, Simon felt as if the final thread connecting him to his life's foundation had been severed. Friends remembered how frail he appeared at the time, a figure that was typically so unwavering. Reduced to silence, he once quietly confessed, "Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever gone through." For a man who had dedicated his life to winning praise, the silence following her death was intolerable. The absence of the woman who had been there from the start could not be filled by any publicity, achievement, or ratings win. The timing made the anguish worse. He had welcomed the miracle of parenthood just a year before, cradling young Eric in his arms as if the future had finally brought him hope. Grief now overshadowed that delight, as though life had demanded a terrible balance, removing his mother while bestowing a son. Nevertheless, there was change despite the suffering. Simon was forced to face both legacy and mortality after Julie's death. He started talking more about his family, being present, and savoring the moments that are so frequently taken away by celebrity. His coworkers observed a new level of patience, tenderness, and sensitivity that had not often shown itself before. Beneath the sardonic humor and stern eyes of the most stern judge on television, there was a son who was grieving not only for his mother, but for both parents, bearing the burden of both gratitude and remorse in equal measure. He was not broken by the loss, but it left a scar that could be seen in the gaps in his speech and the flash in his eyes whenever their names were mentioned. It served as a reminder that, at his core, even the most powerful man on television was just a son who missed his parents. When Simon Cowell reached 60 years old in August 2012, when many people aspire to slow down and enjoy calm, he was hit by a tragedy that was both painful and cruel. A powerful new electric bike is being tested in the courtyard of his Malibu house. A single moment of inaccuracy transformed curiosity into disaster, brutally flung to the ground. His back was broken in several places. The man who had established an empire based on unwavering control lost everything in that one moment. Later, he would sardonically remember, "I was within a minute of failing to make it." This was different for a person who has endured heartbreaks, scandals, and humiliations. It was ruthless, a harsh warning that when fate strikes, even the strongest people are vulnerable. It was a horrible injury. After 6 agonizing hours of operation, a steel rod was placed in his spine, and he was told the horrifying news that one mistake may permanently impair his mobility. The irony was heartbreaking for a guy formerly characterized by a dominating authority, smart suits, and upright stance. The titan of television, the man who controlled the destiny of innumerable dreamers, was abruptly reduced to a hospital bed, unable to sit comfortably and straining to lift a glass of water. Cold monitors that measured his heartbeat and breath took the place of the lights and cameras that had constantly encircled him. Every beep served as a reminder of how near he had been to eternal quiet. Later, he confessed without bluster, "It was more painful than I had ever experienced." The nights turned into ruthless torments punctuated by short, med-induced slumber. The stakes were no about tabloids or ratings. It was life. However, the most devastating suffering was not bodily. It was the memory of his 6-year-old son, Eric, who looked up to his father and clung to him with the same unwavering devotion Simon had once yearned for as a child. Simon feared that Eric may lose him too soon while he lay broken. He subsequently admitted, "I thought of Eric, and I knew I had to fight." That shuddering candor exposed a guy without any armor, battling not for empires but for Lego castles, bedtime stories, and the opportunity to reunite with his son without scars or wires. It was a harsh recovery. Standing needed help. Seasons of television went by without him, and shifting in bed was like climbing mountains. Absence was like defeat to a guy whose identity was control, pale, weak, and hollowed out by suffering, according to friends. However, they also saw another thing: resistance. The same unyielding flame that had propelled him from a mail office to international renown. Slowly, painfully, he walked for the first time. Each one is a victory over hopelessness. His greatest healer, Eric, encouraged his father's stumbling steps and reminded him every day of the need of survival. However, just as Simon was starting to recover, misfortune struck once more. He was involved in a second e-bike accident at the beginning of 2022, injuring his face and breaking his arm this time. The humiliation was brutal, but not as deadly as the shattered back, a mean reverberation of his previous collapse. He was patched and scarred in a hospital gown once more, and he was ridiculed in headlines that referred to him as careless, weak, and even stupid. Simon felt a sharp bodily agony, but the psychological wound was worse. He felt as though fate was mocking him and reminding him that power was never truly in his grasp. It was tragic to be knocked down once. It felt like a punishment to be knocked down twice. Nevertheless, he resisted giving up. Simon later acknowledged that it completely transformed him. Both mishaps turned into mirrors. He thought back on the heedless speed, the restless nights, and the never-ending desire for dominion. And he came to the conclusion that without tomorrow, without family, and without health, none of it mattered. He ultimately made a comeback to the public spotlight, scarred yet unflappable. However, the harshest judge on television was no longer the only one the world saw. They saw a man who had been sharpened by thankfulness, softened by humility, and marked by mortality. Maybe that's why these mishaps continued to be the most unsettling part of his narrative. Because the untouchable mogul was twice brought to quiet, terror, and frailty in a single second. Nevertheless, he discovered a new voice in that solitude. One created in survival, fatherhood, and the harsh, terrible reality that even legends must struggle, fail, and rise again, not in popularity or power. Simon Cowell had already suffered a long list of emotional, physical, and professional scars by the time he reached his 60s. However, nothing could have prepared him for the most severe wound of all, one that was inscribed on his face rather than on his spine from a bike accident or the loss of his mother. It was not an accident or a tragedy of fate. It was self-inflicted and the result of the constant stress of living in front of the television camera, which is the harshest light imaginable. Simon had experimented with cosmetic modifications for years. Fillers there, Botox here. Every operation is justified as upkeep and a defense against aging sluggish progression. The alterations were initially minor, almost imperceptible to the majority. However, the shield started to erode as the years passed and the number of interventions increased. In 2021, both admirers and detractors gazed in disbelief at a man who had changed in appearance. His cheekbones were strangely bloated, his signature grin was frozen, and his once eloquent features were rigid. The headlines were loud. What happened to Simon Cowell's face? Memes spread ruthlessly. Every frame was examined in online forums. And the man who had dedicated his professional life to evaluating appearances was now the target of criticism, derision, and mockery. The irony was cruel to Simon. Control had been the foundation of his empire, regulating talent, regulating stories, and regulating television. But here he was, powerless over his mirror, the most intimate thing. With unusual modesty, he acknowledged in subsequent interviews that I went too far. I actually didn't recognize myself when I looked in the mirror at one point. That confession was more significant than the tabloids ever understood. It was an existential acknowledgement rather than merely a superficial one. Losing recognition in his own reflection was a form of self-destruction for a man who had fought his way from childhood invisibility to global screen ubiquity. Vanity was not the only emotional cost. Simon started to distance himself from the limelight. He skipped promotional tours, cut back on his America's Got Talent appearances, and let others take the lead in events he used to dominate. He appeared worn out, softer, nearly diminished, according to insider rumors. He appeared to have lost the piercing gleam in his eyes that had frightened competitors and mesmerized millions. He talked more about his young son Eric than about ratings and contracts, saying in a low voice, "I don't need to be everywhere anymore." Even still, the scrutiny persisted. "I just want to be there when Eric laughs." On his walks in Malibu, he was followed by paparazzi. Even when there were no new procedures, tabloids conjectured about them, and a microscope was used to magnify each uncommon feature. For the first time, Simon felt what it was like to be the thing, not the person watching. The one on stage, not the one behind the desk. The power was reversed. The judge was now the one being judged. But something unexpected clarity came from that shame. Simon decided to halt. He gave up cosmetic procedures, promising to restore what needles had changed to nature. He thought it was enough. Give it time to mature, show it off. The choice was more than just a matter of taste. With himself, it was a statement of peace. He didn't have to show that he was unbeatable. In order to embrace vulnerability, he paradoxically became stronger. It reminds us that legacy is not about perfect victories, but about the courage to change after failure, to love despite loss, and to keep moving even when broken. He has stumbled, misjudged, and been scarred in the public eye, but maybe that is what makes his journey worth considering. Share your thoughts below. Join us in celebrating not just the legends, but also the frail, flawed humanity that is within them by subscribing to more Untold Chapters. Simon Cowell demonstrates the ultimate truth that empathy, not empire, is the greatest legacy in every scar and shade.